Hello, everybody. I will be covering Schopenhauer's "The World as Will and Representation" in this presentation. Um, I'll be focusing on his views of metaphysics, specifically about the world, but a little bit about ourselves as well. A quick little bit of background here is he was a German philosopher born in 1788. He lived until 1860. His work was influenced by David Hume, particularly his ideas about rationalism, that the knowledge that we have isn't necessarily knowledge of the objective world, more about our perceptions of them, and idealism, which we will see in a minute. Within this book, he also interacts with Kant, and he works off of the Cartesian view. Many of the people around this time did. It was one of the major influencing works. I have here, he was a generally cheery guy. This is sarcastic. He was actually very pessimistic. He had a very bleak view on the world, which we'll see towards the end of this presentation. But he did have some ways to try to surpass that, although we won't be discussing them in this presentation. To start off, he thinks about the common idea of the world. This is just like the typical view that people have. This is that the world has an objective existence, independent of any people. These are categorized by sentiments like, the world was here before I am, and I'll be gone before, it'll be here long after me, rather. And this seems to be common sense among most individuals, but as we've seen, the rationalist tradition has challenged this, and he's going to ask, what do you really know about this external world? And so he presents a problem. He's trying to think about a world existing without any subjects, trying to think of this possibility that there could be a world independent of anything or any subjects inside of it. And so he imagines it, and he asks you, what are you imagining? It's probably someplace in the world. I think maybe space. Maybe you think of just the earth, rocks, or something like that. But when you do that, you notice that you're perceiving some setting, most likely, void of any subjects inside of it, but you're still perceiving from a point of view. For example, you're probably not looking in 360-degree panoramic vision. And that's probably because we look towards the front. We don't conceive all around us. He doesn't go into this, but it's a good way to illustrate this point, is that if the world is there and it's objective, you would kind of, well, you're not perceiving anything, there's no subjects, but everything is all kind of existing at the same time. So what he says is that the conception of the world existing without subjects, it necessarily includes the thing you try to do away with, that is, a point of view from which to perceive from. The perceptible and real world is then a phenomenon of the brain. And as I have here, the assumption that the world may exist independently of all subjects is contradictory. In this way, the world exists as representation. Representation for Schopenhauer just means your perceptions of things, your subjective experience, or ideas. It's that like those qualities or that phenomenology that's in your brain that you're experiencing. That's really what you're experiencing. You're not experiencing the world out there. But Kant thought that there had to be something that exists independently of us that causes our representations. For him, he called them transcendental objects. These are essentially just objects that are mind independent. He says that we can't ascertain the nature of them. There's a few sentiments sort of like this that even Schopenhauer has, that there are certain things that cannot be objects of knowledge, and I'm not going to get into it here, but the important thing is that Kant thought that, there were sort of objects out there that don't require some sort of subject to be there. But Schopenhauer notices that certain things that are required for objects to exist, like space, time, and causality, are aspects of the mind, in that you are perceiving these things. These are more of those representations. And so if those are aspects of the mind, then there really can't be mind independent objects, because those qualities, those aspects would have to be objective themselves. But for Schopenhauer, he doesn't think that they are. So how do we explain where our representations come from? And here he's going to turn towards our own selves. He thinks that at our very center is an unconscious instinct or force he calls the will. This is, or the will to live. He thinks that our body is literally a physical manifestation of the will. That this is presented to us either by our direct experience, in that we feel our body from the insides. It feels like something to have arms and legs and so on. Or we see them like if your hand is sitting on a table, you look at it like it's an outside object. Or I think he says a doctor looking at a patient, like they look at it, they're looking at something that's like an object to them. Although there is obviously this experience being had on the inside, unless of course they're unconscious. And our bodies are of course the only things relative to each of us that are presented in these two ways. He notes that you can't experience mountains or trees from the inside. You're limited to experiencing your body from the inside. And there's actually a really interesting implication of this sort of view. This is what I call the singular action view. He's saying that we essentially have these two kind of aspects, the subjective side and the objective side. But when, like, I move my hand, he says that we shouldn't interpret this as a motivational act that happens first and then causes the movement of my hand, like mental causation. He thinks that the movement of our hands is a single action, in that this action is like two sides of a coin, where one is the subjective feeling of willing your hand to move, and the other is the actual movement of your hand. And these two coincide. They're mutually dependent. You can't have one without the other. And so he thinks that the action of the body is just the act of the will translated into perception. This isn't critical to know for his view, but it does reflect some of the views that he has about the world, which we'll see right now. Notice we were trying to find where our representations come from. And he thinks that our bodies aren't the only things that are double aspected in this way, having an objective and a subjective side. He thinks that plants and animals strive towards existence in the same way that humans do, this will to live. And so everything else, organic, is a will to live as well. And he mentions the inorganic is as, is as well. So everything that exists has a subjective and an objective aspect. And will here is the unexplainable foundation of reality. This will, which everything is manifested from, is like the groundwork. And here we see that this view would imply that everything is one thing, something that he notices is prominent in, I believe it was the Vedanta, the Hindu tradition, or their text. This is a similar thing that they found quite a while ago, and there's been several other philosophers throughout time have had similar sort of conclusions. But this mutual dependence between objective and subjective, or the perceived and the subject, it helps avoid the need for representation causing mind-independent objects. So you don't need to have those things that exist independent of minds that cause your representations. They sort of, your representations correspond, or they like go along with will. And the will is a blind force. And for beings, as manifestations of this will, all life is blindly striving towards nourishment and propagation. We as biological organisms are required to take in food to live, essentially, and to have children to propagate our species. But he notices that organisms have to feed on other organisms. So results this vicious cycle of predator and prey, or life and death, conflict more generally. And here he finds, or this is where we find the source of his pessimistic attitudes. He's asking why does all this suffering occur? So to reflect, the major things that we've touched on here is that he views the world as representation, as like ideas in the mind. He rejects Kant's notion that there are mind-independent objects that cause our representation, and this is instead he proposes his own idea that objects are metaphysically double aspected. They have subject and object qualities, and that the will is the underlying foundation of reality. The world is one. These are some of the major things found in Schopenhauer's Metaphysics. And here I want to discuss potential contention with his view. It's that objects are metaphysically double aspect in this way. And I noted David Chalmers here. He is a philosopher who's around now. He does philosophy of mind and metaphysics. And he is known for this view that I believe it's called panpsychism, that all things have or a better way to put it, consciousness is a fundamental constituent of the world, and that it is present everywhere. And that when we have sophisticated systems to a certain degree, we will find more and more complex cognition. And so you'd find that humans would be very sophisticated, and then cats and dogs would be a little further down, and then you would have things like maybe worms, then smaller microorganisms, bacteria, flagellates, things like that. Until eventually you get down to things that seemingly aren't aware in the same sort of way, but this view would suggest that actually there is some degree of consciousness, even in the most dead, cold, or lifeless things out in the world, like rocks. There is some fundamental aspect that is conscious in it. And maybe that's a sort of, it's not like an awareness in the same sort of way, but it helps deal with certain sort of problems. But as we find, that view is pretty counterintuitive. And not very many people have been willing to take up this sort of this position. I don't think that I'm particularly inclined to pick it up as well, although I think that he's got a lot of really good things in here. His description of the will, I think, is pretty fascinating. I like the way that he handles the mind-body problem, actually, with his singular action theory, that there is no really like mental causation. You know, you think of something you want to do and then you do it. They correspond, or they coincide. But I'm not so sure about this use of objects being metaphysically double aspected in order to resolve the problem of where our perceptions come from. I think that the plain view that he's responding to is more typical among people, and I think it's something that we'll probably stick with, and I will myself. There's certain ways to deal with this problem without resulting to Schopenhauer's view. But overall, I think he painted a very nice picture of this whole problem and had a pretty fascinating approach. Although I'm not so sure that his attitudes about the world being sort of malicious or just his general pessimism is all too warranted. I think there's ways to look at a lot of the things that he said in a very positive way. But overall, this is what he's left us with. And I've got a works cited page on the list here. The last one here. So that is all. Thank you very much, and I hope you guys have a good one.